So let's dive right into learning some Python. And so first things first, you need to start it from a terminal. And we know we are at a terminal because of this dollar sign on the left, the dollar sign prompt. From this terminal, let's start Python. And all you have to do is type the word Python and press return. And once we do this, we see that the prompt has changed to this caret, caret, caret. That's our sign that we are inside the interactive Python interpreter. And this is where we are going to start for much of our first part of the course. The interactive interpreter is really good for practicing and doodling around and making mistakes because the feedback is really quick. So all you have to do is type in a line of code, return, and Python will execute that code for you. So it's really convenient for practicing. So a good way to get into Python is to use it as a calculator. So let's go ahead and do that. And as I type, actually, please type along with me. And this is actually important because what we are doing as we type, as we practice is we are building up a muscle memory around what it feels like to type Python programs. And that's going to be important for feeling and developing a fluency in a language. So please do go ahead and type along with me. So Python as a calculator, it's going to work just like a cloud. Expect the math class. So for example, addition works the way that you are doing 2 plus 2 really does equal 4. And you can deal with non-whole numbers. 1.5 plus 2.25 equals 3.75. You can do subtraction. Python knows about negative numbers. Multiplication works the way that you would expect. You can do division. In Python, in general, the white space in a line doesn't matter. So for example, 1 plus 2 with spaces is exactly the same as 1 plus 2 without spaces. Order of operations works like you learned in math class, and if you want to force an order, we can use parentheses just like you can on a calculator. So for example, if we wanted to say the quantity 1 plus 2 overall multiplied by 3, we can specify that with the parentheses, and variables work like in math class. So if you remember harking back to elementary school, you might have said x equals 4, and then x is now a pointer to the value 4 to the number 4, and we can now use the x in further expressions. So we can now say x times 2 and 4 times 2. X is a pointer to 4, so 4 times 2 equals 8. X plus 5 equals 9. So great. The rules for variable names are pretty simple. It basically needs to be a sequence of letters and underscores the numbers. So basically all in one word. So for example, you could say magic number equals 1500. Or you could say amounts of flour equals 0.75. As long as it starts with a letter and it's single word containing letters and underscores and numbers, you are good to go. And through this process of using Python as a calculator, we have actually secretly learned about not one but two types of data in Python, two types of numbers. And we can prove this to ourselves using this thing called type, the function called type. And let's look at it, and then we will talk about what's actually going on here. So if we type out the word type, and then inside parentheses, some piece of data, some object in Python like the number 1. So if we say type, the name type, inside parentheses, the number 1 and press return, type is a function. So type is a function that takes input and spits out output. It takes as input some object and it spits out. What data type Python understands that object to be? So in this case, the number 1 is an int. It's an integer. It's a whole number. And if we look at the type of 1.0, we see that this is a new class. It's of type float. So this is a number that understands decimal places. So in fact, Python considers these two types 1 and 1.0, and sometimes what you are doing math, you care about whole numbers or you care about decimal places. And Python has two distinct data types to handle that distinction. So this is cool because we already have two data types under our belt, and because we had an opportunity to learn about functions. So a function is just a name and inputs, and it encapsulates a useful bit of work that it does on those inputs and spits out the corresponding output. So like functions in math class, but as we will see, much more powerful and much more flexible. So we have two data types, integers and floats, and we know that we can use a single equal sign to a variable assignment. So I can say x equals 4, and now I can use the variable name x in further computation. And we have learned about this thing called a function, which encapsulates a useful bit of work, and it takes input and produces output. And the first function that we learned is type. And type takes as input some objects like the number 1, and it spits out what class, what type that object is. Let's learn about a new data type in Python. A new data type called a string. And a string is really useful, and we will use it a lot. It's a funny name for a really simple idea, which is just a sequence of characters like numbers and letters, and white space and punctuation put together. And a hallmark of strings is that they are surrounded by quotes. So here are some examples of strings. We have a string hello. We have the string oh really. And we can use this type function from before to confirm that this is in fact a new data type. So if you say type and then a string like the word hello in quotes, we see that type tells us that this is a new class, a type str type string. So strings are going to be how we print and communicate with the outside world. We can smooth strings together. We can concatenate strings to build complicated sentences or complicated pieces of information. So for example, I could say hello plus how we concatenate strings together. So hello plus world, and this produces a single string. That is, those two strings smooshed together. So hello world. In fact, it's very literal. So hello world with no spaces. And if I wanted to have a space in the corresponding resulting text, I would have to supply that space myself. And we can do this in at least two ways. So one way is hello with a space inside the first string plus world. Or we can actually use the plus sign. We can concatenate as many strings as we want in a row. So I could say hello plus the empty string plus world. Variables. So math class variables are just numbers. But in Python, you can assign a variable to any data type, including a string. So for example, I could say, okay, her name is Jessica. So name now points to the string Jessica. And now I can use this variable in further useful work. For example, in a string concatenation, so I could say hello plus her name. Beautiful. Viewers may have noticed that while I've been using double quotes when defining my strings, or when interacting with strings or typing in strings, and at the interpreter, sometimes the way that Python displays the resulting output is with single quote like here. And that's totally fine. So Python actually treats single quotes and double quotes identically, and you have to do it with the double quotes. So I could say hello with double quotes, and Python treats them the same way as long as what I use on the right is the same way as what I use on the right. So that's the story on double quotes with strings. So here is a question for you. What is this? Well, we can use that rule from before. So it is the number one, but it is inside quotes. So if it is inside quotes, it's going to be a string. And we can prove this to ourselves with that type function from before. So what is the type of the quote? One quote. Sure enough, it's a string. Here is a question for you. We know that we can add numbers. I can say 1 plus 1. We know that we can add or concatenate strings. I can say hello plus world. What happens if I try to add or concatenate a string and a number? I could go either way on this. Let's try it out and see what happens. So I press return here. Interesting. So this is a traceback. It gives us a type error. It's probably going to say, I don't know what you mean here, and it gives some useful information about what the problem was, so we can go back and correct it. And it is really important with this idea of tracebacks. So we'll make mistakes, and that's totally no problem. It's very easy to read this and just correct what was wrong. In this case, the traceback says, oh, this was a type error. I don't know how to convert an integer into a string in the way that you want. Like, I know that you want to make the one part of the string hello, but in Python, there is no idea for that. There is no way to just smoosh integers and strings together. So I need more instructions for how to do this. And fair enough. Great. We can fix this. We can actually fix this with a new function. So remember, a function is just the name and an input inside the parenthesis, and it'll spit out output. And there is actually a function that will take a number and convert it to a string. So let's see what that looks like. So we have a number one, and I can use this str function. So str is the name and input inside parenthesis, so str of 1. If we type this and we press return, we get a 1 in quotes. Beautiful. So now we can use this function to apply this transformation on the number one and concatenate the results with our hello string. So for example, we could say hello plus a string of 1. And what do we expect to happen here? Well, we know that we can concatenate strings, and we know that the str function turns a number into a string. So this should work. So let's try it out. Very good. So as we are playing with these strings and concatenation and new functions, a pro tip here is that you don't have to keep typing. You have already done before at the interactive Python interpreter. You can use the up arrow to move back up through previous lines of code that you type. Let's definitely remember to do that and spare as we keep moving. So for example, if I wanted to try this out with a float instead, no problem. Strings are just a sequence of characters in some order. So strings have a notion of a length, and it's pretty common to care about the length of strings. Unfortunately, there is a function in Python that will tell us the length of a string. Its name is len, and it takes as input inside those parentheses the string that we want to find the length of. So for example, the string hello, the length of string hello is 5, as we would expect. You can actually, in addition to being able to add strings or concatenate strings, you can actually multiply strings, which is a little bit funny, but it's kind of fun side effect of the language. So for example, I could take the string A. Again, we know it's a string because it's inside quotes, and we can multiply it by a number if we want. It produces lots of A's. We could say the variable H equals happy. That variable B equals birthday. And then we can do some crazy math on these variables. So let's think about what this would do. So H is the string happy, B is the string birthday. H plus B, we know what that does. Python will concatenate those inside parentheses. So it does the concatenation and then it's going to multiply it by 10. So mentally, let's think about this output. Let's see what happens. And this is a good example of what it is that Python does when you have a complicated statements in one line. It sort of does each piece in turn. So first it says okay, because these parentheses are, first I'm going to add H and B, and then I'm going to multiply by 10. We could even do more work here. Like we could say, okay, take all of this and tell me the length of this overall operation. And Python is happy to do this. So it's really sort of unpacking each piece in turn until you have done the whole operation, and sort of nesting these operations on one line. There is one other detail about strings and about variables, and about, I would put more generally, that we are going to need to talk about now, because it's really important, but we'll actually mostly use this concept later on. It's related to being explicit about when something is output that should be sent to a user. So here is an example of this. If we type just the string hello, or there is just a piece of data that we type in the interactive interpreter and we press return, we see that Python mirrors that for us. Or similarly, if we assign a variable to a value, we can type in the variable and press return, and Python will remind us of what the value is. And this only works interactively, so it's great for us while we are doodling around. But this doesn't work in files, and so when we start writing more substantial programs and files, we need a more explicit way of saying this is supposed to be output to the user. And the way that we expressed that was with the new function called print. So let's take a look. Print. So just the name print, and then inside parentheses the string that you want printed. So for example, hello. So if we type this and we press return, we see that it looks very similar to the above, where we just had the literal word hello. But using this print function ensures that this is actually displayed when we run it from a file. So we are going to really see into the habit of using print, because it's the way that works across all of the ways that you can interact with Python. The expressions inside the print function, so the input to the print function can be as complex as we want. So for example, we had this name from earlier. I can assign the variable name to point to the string Jessica. I can inside this single expression, the input to print, I could say hello plus name. And Python knows how to handle this. It'll say, okay, you want to combine the string hello with the string pointed to by the variable name, and that's the overall string that you want me to print, and this prints what we would expect. The big thing to think is we want to use this print function when we actually mean this is output that is supposed to be displayed to the user, because that's what will work in files and more complicated Python expressions. So that's printing. Keep it in mind, we will see a lot of it later.